everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are just opening up the virtual room, so I see a lot of you are signing on now. We really appreciate you joining us today on one of our most popular webinars, Negotiate Your Compensation Like a Rock Star. We're going to have a lot of fun, and you're going to learn some great tips. So my name's Lauren Horan. I am today's moderator. I'm in the marketing department here at Major Lindsey in Africa. I am just going to go over a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Today, you should all be able to see my screen and hear my voice right now. All attendees are going to be in the listen-only mode for the duration of the presentation. And as a reminder, this call is being recorded. The recording will be sent to everyone via their email addresses, and it will also be available on our website in the next few days. Today's webinar is going to be 1 hour and 15 minutes, including time for Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, if you'd like to submit a question, please do so using the GoToWebinar console. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. Just open the console, type a question, and hit submit. And please note, all the questions are anonymous. We won't share identity with the rest of the audience. At the close of today's webinar, a survey will appear on the screen. We'd love it if you just take a minute or two to fill it out. Let us know kind of what you thought about today's webinar and if there's any other topics you'd like to see us cover. One final housekeeping note, you'll notice a handout section on the console. We have a do's and don'ts surrounding compensation negotiation that we think is a great companion to this webinar, and we hope you'll find it useful. So now let's get on to the good stuff. I'm going to hand it over to our presenters to get started.
Who's going to go first? John, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, those of you on the West Coast. My name is John Nixon. I'm a partner at Duane Morris in the Philadelphia office, and I focus on executive compensation and employee benefits, and I represent executives. And this is the third time I've been able to join Heather and the MLA team, so it's great to be back.
Excellent. Casey, you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll go here. I'm a managing director with MLA. I've been with MLA now coming up on 9 years. Focus only on our in-house placements, give a lot of advice and guidance on compensation and compensation negotiations. And this is my first time doing it with John and Heather, and I'm happy to be here.
We are thrilled to have you. And John, as always, thank you so much for joining us. We're so thrilled that you're here. I'm Heather Fine. I'm a partner in our Chicago office. I've been with MLA for 12 years, which is just, I can't believe it. We talk about compensation all the time. This is my third time doing this webinar, but this one will be a little different because lots has changed in the compensation arena. So I'm going to turn it over to Casey to tell us a little bit about the format of the webinar, and we're going to go ahead and dive in from there.
Sure, appreciate that, Heather. So just as a format of the webinar, we're just going to go over it quickly. We're going to do about a discussion generally about the market, figure 20 minutes or so. Then we're all going to do a role play. Bear with us. We're not classically trained actors, so be kind. And then we're going to do a Q&A like Lauren had mentioned. So I'm going to kick it off. We're going to start the discussion by examining compensation trends and changes that we've seen since the last time we did this in 2021. So first, market conditions, right, as it relates to compensation. Heather, we'll start with you. How have compensation packages or parameters changed over the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years, which have been an interesting 2 to 3 years, to say the least?
Yes, this is an excellent question, Casey. Thank you so much. So I think everybody on this webinar knows that compensation has changed dramatically since the pandemic, but most importantly since 2021 to 2022, when the job market was just very, very, very hot. I mean, I think everyone at MLA would tell you it's the hottest job market we had seen in years. As a result, there was a lot of competition for candidates. And essentially what was happening is that compensation was increasing in order for companies to be able to get the candidates that they wanted. There were so many companies looking for the same type of candidates for particular roles So compensation kept increasing really at every level. So in the base, the bonus, and the equity. At the same time, candidates really were becoming knowledgeable about how to negotiate compensation as well. We'd like to think we helped with that, which is awesome. And so those two factors really contributed to just compensation numbers going up. And I think employers, frankly, at first were very surprised about that, but then we were able to educate them and tell them what we were seeing in the market, which was great. The last thing I'd just say is that, Casey, even though the market has stabilized a little bit, compensation numbers are still high. And part of that is because candidates have either moved in the last couple of years and aren't moving. So there's not as many candidates in the market. Not part of it, that is what it is. There's just not as many candidates in the market right now. There's still a lot of hiring that's slowed as well, but I think clients and companies are understanding that to get the right talent, they're really going to need to continue to pay at or above market, and that market's different than what it looked like 2 or 3 years ago.
Appreciate that color, Heather. And John, you provide executive compensation guidance to GC candidates on a regular basis, probably a day-to-day basis. What are some of the trends that you notice in your practice?
Well, and much as Heather mentioned, I mean, the market's changed a lot since 2021, and compensation as a whole is being affected by external factors. One being, for example, the proxy advisory firms, the two big ones, ISS, Glass Lewis, have really focused on compensation at that top of the house, the named executive officer or NEO level, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. So there is, the parameters in terms of negotiating compensation are, the lanes in a lot of respects are clearer. So in terms of dealing with our clients, a lot of it goes to having a good game plan going in to be responsive to some of these external factors that are looking into compensation more closely.
Appreciate that.
Excellent. All right, so let's shift to the topic we must talk about, the new norm of hybrid work and how it's impacted compensation. So Casey, I'm going to go ahead and kind of start with you and have you talk to us a little bit about how compensation has been impacted by this sort of remote hybrid nature of work. And then also if you could chime in a little bit about relocation generally and how that plays out related to compensation negotiation.
Yeah, absolutely. And not surprisingly, probably to anybody on this call, it comes up in every one of our searches and probably every conversation we're having with candidates today. It's not an absolute answer. I wish I could say it's black and white. It is not. The market's definitely changed on this front. In yesteryear, I would say compensation and hiring was a lot based on location, right? Hiring managers and companies were asking, where are you living and what's the compensation for that area or for that location. Today, it's a lot more, what does the role earn? It does not matter where you live. It does not matter where you're sitting. It's all about what is the general counsel compensation for this role? What is the deputy compensation for this role, regardless of location? And that kind of swings into relocation, right? In terms of relo, we're seeing the pendulum swing back. I think during COVID, everybody was remote. In today's market, we're seeing some sort of hybrid, in office, couple days a week, maybe in office a week a month. So what we're seeing is, companies asking people to be back in the office. So people are asking for more compensation, right? We've been so successful on a remote basis that people are taking that into account when negotiating compensation. And because of it, those candidates who are willing to relocate, they're adding that into their demand for compensation, right? They want a higher reload package, they want higher equity, they want higher total cash to take that leap. I will say there are still a lot of people staying away from opportunities that do require an office. So that also leads into candidates who are willing to relocate, who are willing to move. They can ask for more money because they still understand there are qualified candidates who just won't relocate for a role. So taking a role that will require relocation, they feel they can ask for a little bit more money. And the other thing I would say about hybrid and remote, if people are relocating, going back to your relocation question, Heather, and they are willing to come back into the office, I think severance has come up in a lot more conversations around compensation. I think John will touch on this later. If someone is willing to reload for a role or, go back into the office and step away from their family, they want to know they're protected on the backside if for some reason something went wrong.
Good. John, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I agree with everything that Casey's mentioned. And I think a lot of it too also turns on industry. you saw financial services jump in front of this and say, our protocols, our culture is that you are in the office, and that pretty much is for the entire C-suite. Some areas, some industries are a little more flexible. Tech can be a bit more flexible. In terms of relo, it is, again, to Casey's point, the candidate that has flexibility to relo is going to be very attractive. One of the things that's always a challenge, I had this conversation just yesterday, is sort of the obstacle of teenagers in high school and how that impacts candidates and what they can do with relo. But, for the right candidate, in the right circumstances, accommodations will be made.
Excellent.
Another area I want to touch on is this idea of counteroffer, and that kind of goes to what we've been talking about the whole time, and its impact on the negotiation. Right? It's we'll call it a war for talent, and how employers are handling this with compensation. Right? A real fight for getting the best people. So, John, I'll ask you this first. How are counteroffers or other offers coming into play when candidates are dealing with negotiations? And then a follow-on, how does this impact the candidate's ability to negotiate generally?
So let's sort of play this out, right? Because the counteroffer doesn't come up until there's a disclosure. So by that time, typically we've already gotten to the end of the line, we've cut the deal, we've papered the deal, and the client has now, in effect, informed their current employer, and the counteroffer presents itself. While there's no hard and fast rules, I used to believe that you never accept a counteroffer because I always thought it put a target on your back. I've had a couple of situations where really great counteroffers were made, and we were able to use the concept that the person was willing to walk as a leverage point, and that leverage point could be more compensation, but more often than not, that leverage point is a true path to wherever the client wanted to be. So if the client was, sort of a sector GC, the opportunity to be the GC, the enterprise GC. If the client was a GC and the CLO was there, then that was a leverage point. So I'm not, absolute on counter offers now. I mean, I see that they can be used, but I do ultimately go back to, if you could have paid me this before, why weren't you?
Right. No, I mean, in Casey, I know you're probably going to turn. I'm like, I know you're going to turn to me to ask me, but I agree with John. I agree with John completely. I mean, one of the things, in Casey, you and I were talking about this yesterday, is just listen. A lot of times when folks take counteroffers, 6 months later they're looking again, right? And it doesn't change the situation, right? So if you're going to accept a counteroffer, which by the way they are alive and well, and we see them a lot, and I'm sure John, you obviously see them a lot too. We try to have the conversation early with the candidate to say, do you think you're going to expect to get a counteroffer? How's this going to play out? We try to inform our clients about that so there's no surprises. But I think the biggest thing is that if the counteroffer comes into play, yeah, it might be more money initially. Maybe it's even more money than the role that you're looking at. But why did you go into the job market? Why are you looking in the first place? Right. So, which is a little bit of a different question. So, all right, let's switch gears just a little bit. John, one of the things that we talk about and think about is whether candidates have the same negotiation power, right, or negotiating power. Tell us a little bit about what you see here and how that plays out.
Yes. So there are two scenarios where I see a real delta in negotiation power. If a client has particular experience in an industry, and because we're lawyers, we're typically not subject to non-compete. So some clients sort of knows exactly. I had a client who was in the snack food industry and was approached by another snack food company. That is someone who walks in with just maximum leverage because the gear up, the training up, that's not necessary. They know the industry, they know the players, that's someone who will come in with great leverage. Now, that's not always the case, obviously, because if you're a deputy GC and you're looking for a GC opportunity, you'll jump industries because that's the opportunity. Or if you want to get into a public company, you're at a private company, you'll jump those opportunities. The other place where I see a lot of leverage is if you're, you're on your second GC, you're looking for your third one. You've been, you've been in, you've been a public company GC, and then another public company approaches you. There is experience is experience at the end of the day, and people will pay for that. And typically by the time you're a public company GC, you're not exactly, as my daughter would say, you're not thirsty. You've been at the fountain for quite some time, and they really have to make it worth your while to move. So those are two key leverage points that I see. And look, listen, I understand everyone doesn't have those, but boy, if you do, it's a nice game to be in.
Casey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, again, not surprisingly, I agree with John, right? He on everything he said. The only thing I would add, what I see is when we're doing first-time general counsel searches, and I think this is exactly what John was saying, if you're a deputy and your driver really is to get to that next level, companies recognize that, right? And you may see this in our role play, but companies recognize that you're stepping up, and that's your driver, right? A company is always looking for, is cash the driver, or is it really about opportunity? And you'll see companies try and sometimes not take advantage, but really play the hand they have when giving somebody that GC opportunity. And I think that's, it's a good place to be in because you're getting a GC opportunity, but on a compensation front, it makes it a little bit harder for you to negotiate. I'll jump in here a little bit. I want to talk about compensation culture and what that actually means. Heather, we'll start with you here. When you hear compensation culture, right? When you hear that term, one, what does it mean to candidates, and how does it impact their negotiation perspective?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I'm going to really look to John to kind of fill this in because he's in conversation all the time.
Yeah.
This is the way I think about it, right? Is how a company thinks about the components of it, different right? So I'm glad, John, you're shaking your head because I wanted to make sure I had the right answer, right? Yeah. No, but in all seriousness, many companies just look at the let's call it the base, the bonus, and equity. I'm thinking traditional company in different ways. If you're in a private company, and we're going to let John definitely talk about all this, that compensation looks a little different. But are you going into a company where, for instance, yesterday I had a conversation, base salary was really, really high and the bonus was really low, right? Sometimes you're going into a situation where the base salary or the cash, base and bonus, may be lower and the equity may be really high. The only thing I would just say here is I think as a candidate, you want to know at the end of the day what's important for you, right? Are you someone that actually needs the cash? And so, an opportunity where you're heavy on the equity but not heavy on the cash, that may not be so great for you, right? So, when I think about compensation culture, I think it's just understanding how a company looks at those different components of compensation. But John, what do you think?
No, Heather, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, sort of some of the major dividers of culture are obviously industry, going from public to private. I always tell people, look, if you're going to a private portfolio company, the base comp may not be as high, and that equity can't be monetized. So, you've got to make certain that you could pay the tuition and the mortgage and everything from whatever that base is, because it's not exactly like you're going to turn those levers of equity on and convert that to cash. The key, I think, people have to understand is, short of you being the Jamie Dimon of lawyers, no one is going to change their culture for you. No one's going to change their culture for a general counsel. Okay, you may be able to get some improvements. You may be able to do well within that culture, and that's what we always sort of say is, what is the culture, and how can we do our best within that culture? But if they have a very heavily equity-based, performance-driven culture, then you either have to be willing to accept that or look for the next opportunity. So, one of the things that we always start with, and I'm certain Heather and Casey, as they vet candidates, they say, is cash a driver for you, or is, not to make it so clear, but is wealth creation a driver for you? Because you may be at a point in your life where, hey, I could keep the lights on. I'm looking for generational wealth here. So that's a different type of opportunity. And you have to know that going in, what you want.
Good. All right. Before we get into the most exciting part of our webinar, although we think this part's exciting too, for the role play, we want to ask John a really important question on two fronts that we always ask John about because we're so curious. Basically, the public versus private company compensation. So we know several folks here want to hear about it. Talk to us about how to assess compensation packages at a private versus public company. And then also let's throw in that PE-owned portfolio company. So that whole piece, if you could talk a little bit about how we think about compensation there.
Okay, so for the public company, I don't want to say it's easy, but it is pretty transparent because you're going to have the securities filings, you're going to have the proxy, you could have access to other employment agreements that have been filed. So you should be able to, if you're skilled, you should be able to kind of get a good sense of the culture. Now, there may be some levers within there, but you should be able to get a good sense. Private companies are a different beast, and each one is uniquely different because, for example, if they're a portfolio company and there's private equity, each private equity firm comes to the discussion with its own philosophy that it typically utilizes throughout its portfolio companies. So Carlyle, if you're a portfolio company of Carlyle in manufacturing, they have a formula that they're going to use for you. And you have to kind of figure out, okay, what are the levers within that formula? One of the biggest levers obviously is going to be equity, and trying to figure out where you as general counsel fall within that equity tier. And again, this is where it goes to the difference between, I need cash versus I'm trying to do wealth creation. In a portfolio company, that is the play. The play is wealth creation, that you're going to be there for the exit event. So, if I get a client who, and look, listen, it's just through the luck of their career, they've been in public companies all this time and they've been getting stock and so forth. And now someone's saying, well, you're going to get RSUs that may or may not vest because they only vest on an exit event. Well, you've got to be able to live with that. Okay. And, that is part of the culture of going to a private company is, can I live on what may be a smaller base and having less access to cash?
John, do you advise people to stay, and I'm just curious about this, to stay till an exit event? Like if someone comes to you and then how do they manage?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you got, I mean, that's the thing. That's the whole play. The whole play is that you're staying until the exit event. Now, that's not to say if, great opportunity knocks on the door, that we can't sort of quantify what that exit event would have looked like and then try to grab that.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But no, I mean, I'm assuming that if you go to a portfolio company, one, you believe in the company's long-term success and the potential for an exit event. And two, you have the means to survive until that exit event occurs, or if it never occurs.
Okay, no, exactly. But that part you said about 100%, the part you said about quantifying what someone might leave on the table if they leave, let's say 2 years before the company is supposed to have some sort of an event is really interesting because we have that conversation and it's a lot.
And a quick piece on that, not to delve too far into tax law, but typically these portfolio companies will be doing annual valuations, what's called 409A valuations, which is a section of the code that deals with deferred compensation, but also applies to equity grants in a sort of peculiar way. So that gives you a readily available metric for how the company is doing and what your potential position would be. The other thing I always tell people is, look, listen, if there's a cap table, which there should be, a capitalization table, find out what is being set aside for the management team. How do you fit within there? How do they project your fitting within there? So there's ways around it, but I will tell you, the private side is definitely, it's a secret sauce, and you gotta really put your head down to figure it out.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, I think that's it for our questions, or this section.
Yes, thank you so much for that information. And now we are moving on to the role play. This is where John, Casey, and Heather will play different characters, demonstrating some of the complexities they've just discussed. After the role play, we are going to move on to the Q&A. So for the role play, Heather is going to play the role of the search consultant, big stretch for her, who has presented a candidate for a GC role at a public company. Heather learned that her candidate will be getting an offer and had shared that with the candidate already. So when the role play starts, Heather has just gotten the actual offer numbers from her client, and she needs to share them with Casey. And Casey will be playing the role of that candidate. He's currently a DGC at a public company, one that is larger than the company he hopefully will be joining as a GC. He knows an offer is coming, but at the start of the role play, he doesn't yet know the specifics. And John Nixon will be playing himself, partner at Duane Morris, specializing in executive compensation matters. All right, take it away, role players.
All right, congratulations again, Casey. This is fantastic. I just got the specific numbers from our client, and I'm ready to share them with you. But first, I want to make sure you're still excited, because being excited is always one step in a healthy negotiation. How are you feeling?
I'm really excited. I realize this is what I've always wanted. I'm excited to take the role. Obviously, I'll need to see their offer in writing and figure out if it's at the top end of their stated range. But I'm excited, Heather.
Awesome. I'm thrilled. Okay, so you've confirmed your interest in the role. Now you need to confirm your value and your readiness to assist upon that. So the offer they asked me to present is within the range shared, which was $650,000 to $750,000 in cash, which is the base and bonus, plus equity. I admit there have been times, at times they've been careful to point out that you don't have the actual GC experience, but they did come in at $450,000 as a base, plus a 50% bonus, and an annual equity grant of $250,000 of RSUs. So they're within the range at $675,000 in the cash, but the total package of almost $1 million. It's a really strong sign of interest on their part, especially since they wanted to place a sitting GC in this role. You've done a great job in their process, and I am thrilled for you. It's a great offer.
That is great. A bit low than I was hoping, but I do appreciate them wanting to take a chance on me and being within the range set from the beginning. I get that they wanted to get a sitting GC candidate, but I also want to make sure I'm being paid what the role is worth. So how do I go about confirming to myself that this offer is appropriate? I don't really want to blow this because I might only have one chance.
Absolutely. So I have professional advice as a search consultant, and I'll share that with you freely. But for a public company GC role, I strongly suggest you seek additional advice on the compensation front. You only get one bite at the apple, just like you said, and you want your counter, should you make one, to be all-encompassing and shared at one time, not piecemeal. So be prepared for them to push back if you counter. They'll likely point out that there's a risk on their part because you're a bit unproven.
Unproven? My current employer is larger and has a much larger legal team. So I'm already managing almost as many people as I would in this new role. That surprises me to hear, and frankly, I'm a little insulted by it. I don't know how to assess whether that's a tactic being used against me in negotiation or really their honest assessment to my fitness for the role. Between me and you, I am a little insulted by it.
Okay, oh no, I don't want you to be insulted. Please, please. They are very excited about you. But I guess if I'm being honest, it's a little bit of both here. When I presented your candidacy, I knew they wanted a sitting GC. So I took a risk just by including you on the slate, but I believed in you. So I followed the same logic you did, that your current role wasn't that much smaller in scope in the new one. And I really think that you're ready to be the top dog. Their offer communicates that they think so too. But what happens next is a little bit of a delicate dance of competing interests.
And their interest is in paying me less money?
No, that's not actually what I meant. What I was referring to is the fact that they're public. And so the top 5 compensated executives have their salaries listed in public filings, which can complicate things if someone's salary is out of line with the scale. Being public also means, as you know, there's a compensation committee that has to approve these offers. And they already took a vote and approved of the range I took to market about 3 months ago. There's just a lot to consider on both sides at this point.
I hear you, Heather, and I appreciate it. I know you're trying to stop me from sharing my current compensation, but I think it's relevant. I want to make sure I'm getting enough of an increase for what they feel is a stretch role for me.
So in this client's jurisdiction, we're not allowed to take into account your compensation. So if you tell me I don't know how to ignore the information and not take it into account as we counter, I'm not supposed to use that information to get you a better deal, or frankly, have the client decide to pay you something less than what the job is worth. The package is supposed to reflect what the new role is, not the role you're leaving. But if you share it with me and ask me to share it with them, I can.
But the problem is I'm going to end up basing my counter on making sure I get a sizable increase from my current pay. So I'm taking it into account anyways. And I need some objective advice on whether this move makes good career sense for me from a financial perspective.
All right. I think you mentioned receiving a referral to an excellent lawyer at Duane Morris who can give you that perspective. I would call that person if I were you. I believe it's John Nixon. For now, I will say it is better to focus on what's right for this role, for what you want to accept, because that's what's most relevant here. But also because when I approached you about this role, the estimated comp range was between $650,000 and $750,000 cash, plus undisclosed equity, and they've offered you a strong equity grant and cash within the range. Do I think there's wiggle room? Yes, sure. I mean, there's always a little bit of room, but in this case, probably not a ton. I think you can secure a little bit extra for yourself if you're smart about this and negotiate well.
Wait, so you're not going to negotiate on my behalf? I don't want to take this job and have an awkward relationship with the CEO day one because of it.
No, that is fair. So actually what happens is that I play somewhat of a middle person. So I'm more neutral than an advocate. I'm more neutral than an advocate, unless I feel the employer is being unreasonable. When they make an offer that's generally in the range they shared, I don't usually find that unreasonable, although maybe at times there might be some different reasons for that. But I do believe that a good counter could get you slightly more. Ideally, I'd want us to have the conversation about the counter, and then I would convey your points to the client. It helps us avoid any tension that could arise.
Okay. I'm glad that you're still in the middle. It sounds like I better call that Duane Morris referral I received before telling you my counter. His name is John Nixon.
Hi, Casey. I hear congratulations are in order.
Yes, John, it's good to finally meet you in person. I'm excited for my first GC role, but I'm also scared that I'll leave things on the table and regret not capitalizing on this opportunity more. I have worked very hard to get to this point in my career, and I think I deserve the top end of the range, if not more. Not to mention, I'm hoping to one day retire in style and also help my kids get through college.
Well, those are great objectives. So one of the things that's always, you're leaving a public company, so I assume you have some equity on the table. Have you disclosed that? Have you calculated that yourself? Do you have an idea of how much you'll be walking away from?
No, I did what you said, and I simply said I was switching financial advisors and wanted all the available paperwork on value of my vested and unvested equity. They sent it to me and I sent it to you.
Okay, great. We'll take a look at that, but your unvested equity, as well as us trying to kind of get an idea of how much bonus you're walking away, those are things we want to put on the table. And now I'm pulling it up now on my screen. It looks like you have quite a bit vested already. So what's the backstory there?
Yeah, so I've been there for about 15 years here, haven't left yet. So I have a lot vested, but I get the grant annually, so a lot still hasn't yet. I don't want to walk away from that, especially at this time of the year.
Okay, now what have you told them about your equity?
I had to put in writing what I thought I was leaving behind. I wasn't comfortable, but I felt I had to do it. I wish I had called you at that stage, but it felt premature. I wrote $250K.
Okay, all right. No worries. One of the things that we're going to do is we're going to pull up either if you have a dashboard or you have a nice third-party representation of your equity, we could provide that to them. And that way they could see it's clean, it's not, it's not an estimate. This is what's on the table. So don't worry about doing the math yourself. We'll just put it there. They have total rewards people. They'll be able to figure it out. But at least we're putting a stake in the ground that this is something you expect to be compensated for to come over.
I wish I had known this sooner. I did the math myself and it was agony. I wish I had come to you. And I admit I am more focused on the cash piece of the offer since I'm the main breadwinner at home. And I always have learned cash is king, especially in this uncertain economy. Just to give you some background, my income pays our bills, and I worry a 15% bump in income won't be enough to reflect that additional time I'll be spending away from home. And I know my current company is bigger, but the GC I report to makes more than the $665K they're offering me. So what I really want to stress to you is that this is a public company that supposedly views the GC as a business leader and a member of the C-suite, which is really important to me. If I'm going to be responsible for contributing to the overall corporate performance, I think my pay should reflect that, no matter my seniority. Right now, the outbound GC is listed on the annual report as an executive officer. I think that's a good sign, right?
That absolutely is a good sign. But the first thing we're going to do is try to kind of come up with a negotiation strategy. And that is going to be driven by figuring out the compensation culture of the company. Every company has its different views on compensation, but they sort of generally fall into main categories, if it's industry driven, or if it's public or privately driven. And we need to get a good grasp of that culture, because the mistake you can make, Casey, is asking for more isn't necessarily a mistake. Asking for more when it doesn't have a rationale behind it is a mistake. So if you could frame your request in the context of respecting their culture, that will lead to success. I like to look at it in terms of two things. You want to have basically vertical equity. So that's you as GC being compensated appropriately within the C-suite of the company. And, that's always sort of the first lever. But if that doesn't get us quite where we need to be, sometimes we look at horizontal equity. It's a public company. We know what their peer firms are. So to the extent that we can identify peer firms that also list the general counsel on the NEO as an NEO, we could use that to kind of leverage in where you should fall in. I will tell you, this is more art than science, but that's a little bit of the science that you can have. You could use those public filings to actually figure it out. So you mentioned that the previous general counsel was an NEO. We have that as a base point. We know what she made, so we therefore know exactly where they valued it. Now, that may not be right for you, but at least we have that as a pretty good benchmark. So as we begin to kind of look through this, we're gonna figure out, what portion we want to put in cash, what portion we want to put in the bonus bucket, and the long term. I like to think of it as three. I like to think of it in terms of a total number, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, what's the total package? That's going to be our wealth creation device. So let's not ignore equity by focusing solely or exclusively on cash. In terms of the pay of your current pay and your old company's GC's pay, that may or may not be relevant. I mean, again, we have to come in within the culture of this opportunity, and we can work together for you to present something that really sort of fits within that culture, but maxes your value within it.
I appreciate that guidance, John. It's actually really helpful because obviously this is new territory for me. I've been with my company a really long time. I'm curious your thoughts on, them bringing up that I've never been a true GC before. I'm a little uncomfortable that they brought that up now. It feels like they're using it as a tactic to lowball me on compensation.
They probably are. Okay. But at the end of the day, you're going to be putting in every hour that the prior GC put in, probably even more. Okay. And you do bring a skill set. You bring a fresh set of eyes. You bring a fresh set of analytical abilities that should be rewarded. So the fact that you are a quote unquote first time new GC, kind of ignores the fact that you've had a legal department larger than the one you're currently going to. And don't discount that. I mean, the thing we don't want to do at any time, Casey, is negotiate against ourselves. And, the first time GC narrative is something that people often fall prey to. Don't allow yourself to do that.
I appreciate the candor, John. And I want to thank you for walking me through this. I'm ready to go back to them now. I'll be doing my own negotiation, as you know, but I knew I wanted to help. Thanks again.
All right, Casey. First of all, I just want to say thank you. You've been so awesome and timely. You've called me, keep me in the loop. You're candid, you're open, you're honest. That just helps us all get to the right place. So thanks for being so great. All right, you're awesome. So are you ready to talk about your counter? Because I am eager to hear about it.
I am. So I ended up talking to John. He's great. It was a really good referral for me. My whole thing is capturing the right tone in the discussion with him. You know, I don't know whether you want to hear the numbers first or the explanation first, but I'll do the explanation first because I think it makes the most sense. I've quantified my walkaway. It's approximately, let's call it 450,000. I can give you my Fidelity dashboard if that's what they need. We're also trending toward an annual cash bonus of around 300K. So I'm through 60+% of the year. I can't walk away from that. That's first. With respect to the terms you communicated, I discussed the package with John, as I told you. I compared the offer to what the outbound GC is listed as making in the filings. I went back to see what the GC made when she first started. I compared my offer to the CFO's current income because I want to be considered an equal. John and I did a lot of comparing to determine this company's compensation culture. We agreed that the equity grant was clearly in keeping with that culture and that asking for more might be a mistake on my part and the wrong tone to set. So we look closely at the cash component and see that a 50% bonus is generally what the rest of the C-suite is awarded. So that left us with the actual salary. I know you can't take into account my current earnings, but to me, it is clear that I will be spending substantially less time with my family in this new role. And so I'm looking for a substantial increase in compensation to offset that reality. Separately, since this role is meant to be a truly business leadership opportunity, and as GC, I would be expected to sit at the table with the rest of the C-suite and contribute to the business decision, I think a slight narrowing of the delta between the CFO and the GC's base would communicate the right message both internally and externally. I think we can accomplish this with an extra 70K annually, split between cash and equity, bringing a total base up to 485 and total cash comp up to from 675 to 725, which may seem like a small amount to negotiate over, but it would send me the message that the company means what it says about how this role is meant to operate at the GC level, and I'm still well within the original range, but not at the very top.
Okay, just so I know what you're talking about. So it's 630,000 in sign-on cash and equity, in addition to a cash increase of 8% and an equity increase of 14%. Is that correct? It seems fair, but did I get that right?
Your notes were perfect. After I said a lot there, you're absolutely right. And I understand it's certainly an increase. I'm not trying to be greedy, but I am staying well within the range. And given all the factors discussed with John and his advice and guidance, I think it's a good counter.
Yeah, listen. Yes, it's a little steep. That is totally okay because I think it's reasonable. And your explanation is what's really, really helpful. So let me get with the CHRO. I'll socialize this and then we can get things moving along. The one thing though is I'm definitely first going to start out telling them how excited you are about this opportunity and that you really want things to work.
I am really excited.
Awesome. All right.
And see.
Roll like concluded.
Bravo.
Thanks.
That was excellent.
Yeah.
Casey, I wish you luck. That was really fun and informative too. So thank you so much. And now we are on to the Q&A part of the webinar. I've got some interesting questions coming in, so I'm going to share them with John, Casey, and Heather. I know we touched on this in the role play a bit, the question of revealing your compensation and your compensation expectations. One of our audience members asked, how do you deal with employers who want you to tell them what your compensation expectations are before they tell you what the pay range is? This person said they have only had 2 potential employers not do this. One was for an associate general counsel position that wouldn't talk to this person further when they asked for 250K. So now they are gun shy and afraid. I am undercutting myself, but afraid to go too high.
John, I'd love your take on this because I know Heather and I have talked about this.
Well, so let's sort of take one key fact. That's an associate general counsel role. All right. The leverage is not there. Um, and I tend not to work in that space. But when you have the leverage, when you're someone who's been identified as, one of the final candidates at a deputy GC, CLO level, you're going to have a lot of leverage. And I always say, your role is to make them fall in love with you. And you can make them fall in love with you without, doing that. Because I assume, when Heather and Casey, when you guys reach out to candidates, you have a sense of the range. So the candidate wouldn't have responded if they weren't within range. So to me, that question is redundant, and I would not have my client answer that. I would say, let's continue our discussions. Let's make certain this is the right fit.
So John, let me ask a piece of this. You and I have talked about this a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So let's say it's on an application, right? That somebody, again, maybe it goes back to the leverage that, because the general counsel isn't filling out an application where they have to put down their comp. And also a lot of times GCs are going to give their comp because it's in the proxy, right? And they want to make sure they're not undercompensated. But like, I think sometimes what I hear is that people are asked for it on applications and they don't know what to put. And let's say a search firm isn't involved, because you're right, we do give the range fairly early in the process. We do ask about expectations usually in our first phone call, but we don't want to hide the ball, frankly.
Right. Boy, if someone had a written application that asked them what you expect to make, I don't know. I'm thinking that's maybe not the opportunity I want. But for the sake of answering the question, put down a number that you would think of a number that you'd be absolutely happy with, and then throw 15% on it. But I really, there's so many factors that go in. What's going to be what's the cash? What's the bonus breakdown? What's the LTIP breakdown?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because Casey, I feel like we get that from some of our candidates, right? They're like, what do we put like on this application or whatever? Yep. Not when they're necessarily working with us. It's candidates that call me and they say, I'm applying for this job. But anyway, I think that's a good answer. It's hard.
And I say the same thing John does. I say, if they're making you answer the question, we don't make you answer that question, obviously. But if they're making you answer a question, put a number that you'd be comfortable with. And obviously, you're going to learn more in the process. And as you learn more, you're very in your right to change that number because you learn more about the role, responsibility, and it's not as if you're locked in.
Right. And the turnaround question is, what's the range for the role, right? So if you're on the phone, we get this all the time, right? Which is, say, oh, what are your compensation expectations, right? Someone turns around and says, what's the range for the role? And I answer that question because why hide the ball? You know what I mean?
Right.
There's no point in doing that.
That's right.
All right. Thank you. Another question, going back to the conversation we had about public versus private companies. Someone asked, any thoughts about how long is too long to wait for the private company exit event, since it extends that amount of time you are not working as a public company GC?
Yeah.
John, that's you.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Is the private company WeWorks? So, I mean, look, one of the things that I mentioned is if you're at a private company, you have faith in the company. You see the company as something that could be successful and could lead to an exit event, a potential unicorn. So you're in the building. You probably have better access to information and better sense of whether or not that will materialize or not. And if you start to get the feeling that that's not going to materialize, you better get out, because otherwise you're burning away good years of your career that you're not going to see the upside on. So, how long is it? I mean, it's the moment that you don't feel that sense of enthusiasm and that sense of optimism, you probably need to reach out to Casey or Heather.
Yeah, and just to add real life examples, over the last couple of years, equity capital markets and IPOs have stopped in a lot of ways. And, a lot of candidates have reached out to us and said, it's palpable here that we're not going public for at least another 3 to 5 years. And they're looking to make the move. So to John's point, you'll feel it. If you're on the executive team, you'll know if there's something on the horizon, especially as a general counsel, because you're reviewing the docs at the front end.
Right.
Thanks. Thank you. And you mentioned John, this is a good segue to talking to Casey and Heather. And someone asked, how do you go about building a relationship with a recruiting firm such as MLA so that they're comfortable presenting you for a stretch role?
Yeah, Casey, you go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a transparent individual, I guess. So, look, we present people to stretch roles, right? That's not out of the ordinary. We're honest with our clients when we say this person is a stretch. Heather and I are working on a search right now where we actually just said that. However, and I'm not saying woe is us, but we're hired to find a certain type of individual for a role, right? So, that we do have people who are doing IP for the last 30 years and want to be a general counsel of a pharma company. We're probably not going to present you. That's just, the reality of it. But if, you have some of the right skills, you have that leadership opportunity, let's have the conversation. We'll figure out if this is the right opportunity to be presented for a stretch role and, staying on our radar. I think that's the best advice we have, and coming to things like this and, asking questions. I think it's important.
I also say too, staying in touch, like if we have an initial conversation, listen, we talk to a lot of people every day, all day long, and I'm just, we can be really candid, like Casey, clearly it's the conversation of candor, but reach back out to us once every quarter if you haven't heard from us. And just to be really honest, we're not always going to have a role, right? And that's okay. And so we're going to give you tips about the other things you should do in your job search while you're looking. In terms of the stretch role, though, I agree with what Casey said. The more we get to know you, I think it does help us advocate for you with clients who are open to hearing about candidates that may be outside of the box. The biggest piece is, the reality of this is, we just have some clients who, if it's a public company GC role, they want a sitting public company GC. That's it. They're not going to be looking at people who are outside of the box there. And I try to be honest with people and just tell them, because this is a big deal, right? You get really excited about things and you want to know if they're going to work out or not. And so on the front end, if I don't think it's going to work out, I'll tell you that. Or if I'm going to submit you and you're an outside of the box candidate, just like we did in the role play, we think, for example, we thought Casey in the role play was at an equally large company, managing a large team. That was a great, we're going to say, listen, we hope this works out. It may not but because I think you're great, I'm going to present. So, I think it is just getting to know us a little better, and we getting to know you as well, of course.
And just as an aside, the role play comes from a real situation that we've submitted people for, right? It was a stretch role, and the compensation conversation came about, and that's where the role play comes from. Real situations where we present stretch candidates.
And absolutely. And GC compensation is just, it's again going back to that, the way we opened this. And John, I'm sure you agree. It is very high. Compensation is just high, right? And it should be, right? It continually increases. And I mean, we're seeing that across the board on public company GC roles for sure, as it should be. I think that's just where the market's going.
Mm-hmm. No, I would absolutely agree with that. And, boy, just the experience opportunity. And that's something that also factors in, is that you may or may not, the compensation may not be the driver. The driver may be adding to the portfolio of skill sets.
Mm-hmm. That's such a good point. So sometimes we advise people to take roles because they don't have a specific skill set they're going to need for it. So let's say they're a corporate and securities lawyer and they haven't had any operational or commercial experience. Guess what? Something you probably need to become a general counsel. So if you go take a general counsel role of a business unit, you've got your background in governance and corporate and securities. Now you need to get that other piece of it, right? And that compensation may be a lateral move, and that's okay, because that's going to give you the skills you need to take it to the next level.
I think someone had submitted kind of a similar situation to what you were just talking about in the role play. This person has said, I've been a GC for 2 smaller privately held organizations, and have been for a few years, I'm a deputy GC/SVP CCO at a publicly traded organization. How does that experience look in a negotiation moving forward if I want to return to a GC role? Similar to what you were.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, and obviously they'll disagree with me if they do. I like that, right? You've been at the top of a company. You've been, even though they were private, you've moved to the public sector, right? You know what that entails, right? Filings, extra fine-tooth comb going over everything you're doing. You've also had the operational side, and to Heather's point, and I think we all at MLA, and John probably agrees with this too, the broader you can get your experience, those are the people who become your general counsels. It's not folks who just say, I do IP and that's all I do, or I do funds work. It's the folks who have that operational, strategic type mindset, that business mindset, that are looked at for general counsel, right? You really need to broaden out your experience. So in this particular example, it sounds like you've done the right thing, right? You really broadened your shoulders to where you're setting yourself up for that next step.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I don't want to overgeneralize because Heather and Casey are the folks who really sort of package you and present you. But boy, being a GC at a smaller privately held company means you're wearing a lot of hats and you're developing a lot of on the ground, real business decision-making skills. So you walk into a public company and you walk into the CFO's office and the CEO's office, and yes, you're primarily a lawyer, but you're not merely a lawyer. You're an advisor. And I could see where that would be very attractive.
Completely. Lauren, there was one question I saw about how big of a factor is the size of the company when determining compensation for a GC role. So example, if it's a public company, a private company, I'd certainly be interested in John's thoughts on that. I can certainly give some thoughts as well, and I'm sure Casey can too. But John, is that something you want to start out with maybe?
Yeah, so size of the company, let's talk about public companies first. Size of the company it's important, but it also sets up very hard guardrails because in every proxy, they will identify who they view as their peers. So you're not going to have to guess at that. If you're a company with a $25 billion market cap, they will sort of identify other companies that are in that same range, and that's how they peg compensation. Because look, as much as we as lawyers like to think the world revolves around us, the world revolves around CEOs. Okay, the CEOs are measuring themselves against other CEOs, and ISS and the Fred Cooks of the world, the comp consultants of the world. That's how they make their money, by sort of developing that empirical data. And one of the big drivers of that is size of the company. With respect to private portfolio companies, again, I cannot stress this enough. It is about the culture of the principal PE fund owner. Okay, if they have a culture that rewards and that views GCs as sort of co-equal partners, then great. If their culture views them as slightly less, then that's going to be reflected. So I think on the private side, it's less driven by size and more driven by the culture of the PE owner.
And I see one of the questions here, and I think it's just good to add on to there. It talks about how do you get, if you're being hired at a top level, a CCO or a general counsel, and they're not offering equity, and it's a pre-IPO company and it has private equity backing. I would say look to the other folks that, say it again?
I said walk.
Yeah. I would say it goes back to the compensation culture, right? I'm with John, walk. There's a reason why. I would say the main reason why is they don't value the general counsel.
Yeah, exactly.
And,
yeah.
Any of our clients, we tell them the same thing. If you're not willing to offer equity, you're telling the market the GC is just a check of the box. It's not a partner.
Yep.
And I think this point's really, just so everybody knows, we share our anecdotal experiences with our clients. So they have their compensation consultants, but we tell them, we just placed somebody in a very similar role a year ago. This is what this is what the market was telling us we needed to pay for this individual. And if they're lower, they need to understand the caliber of their candidate. Casey and I have this issue right now. The caliber of their candidate is going to look different compared to maybe what they want. And that's important to know as well. The one other thing I wanted to say too, just coming down from the GC level for a second, big public companies often pay people at the business unit level and the DGC level really strongly. Sometimes they don't, right? There's a lot of things that go into, it's not just the size, right? When we're talking about those other roles. Again, though, back to some of the things we've been talking about earlier, if you're in a negotiating position, for you to be able to know and understand what peers are making and what people in a similar position are making through your research and the benchmarking and your conversations with other people, that's really helpful to go in there, because then I think a client, if they're reasonable, is going to look and say, we say client, we're all saying client, we mean companies.
Right.
Sorry, we're using our lingo, but you know, I would say that I think it's really important at the end of the day that basically you have the information you need to be able to say to the company, this is what I understand in most cases that this role pays, if you don't have a search firm and a recruiter or someone like John who's helping you with the negotiations. That's the other thing. It's different if you've got me or Casey or John involved versus if you're doing it on your own with the company directly.
Yeah. And by the way, if you're doing it on your own, and a lot of GC candidates, deputy GC candidates, lawyers want to negotiate for themselves. And it's sort of the first opportunity that you have to share your skill set in negotiations. So, you know, the norm when I'm working with lawyers is that I am not involved visually. I'm sort of a ghost assistant to them. I'm in the background, you know, we're working through strategy, but they're doing the negotiation. But you really should, you know, sort of view that as a real opportunity to show the skill set that you're going to use on their behalf going forward.
So one thing I think that's right. I absolutely think that's right. I am curious, John and Casey, I'm bringing up about what you think about this. Is it ever possible that there's a package that's strong enough that someone just doesn't negotiate? And so to the point about showing the skills about being a negotiator, can there be cases where, you know, we are going to advise people, this is actually a terrific package, and if you feel good about it, take it?
I'll jump on that. Public company, NEO position, you see what the prior GC made, you know what that ratio is relative to the CFO, and usually we're pegging off of the CFO. If the package is right, it's right. So I mean, you know, I'm not someone of the belief of negotiating for the fun of it. I mean, it is hard, it is stressful, it is an involved process. And when a company comes to you with a very, very good offer that within their culture hits on all the touchstones, then why prolong? Now, I'm not saying you won't want to negotiate maybe some of the non-compensatory terms like severance, reload, those things, but no, you don't negotiate for the sake of doing it.
Thank you. Just a general question about working with a search consultant. Are there any things you should and should not share with a search consultant?
Well, so I'm going to answer
John's
this.
smirking because he knows an answer.
No, I don't want to answer that question.
Right.
That's fine.
I'll start. Listen, I always say it is as you saw in the role play. I thanked Casey for being so candid and transparent. We think the more information you can share with us, the better. Not because we want to use it in any way other than we just want to make sure our client is informed, so there's no surprises, right? And that goes from forget compensation. That's about relocation. That's about timing issues. That's about everything, right? From our perspective, transparency is key in order to really work successfully for everyone. Now, compensation, I mean, you know, we see every sort of different thing. And I think John said earlier, you know, I wouldn't come out and tell people what you're making, right? And most people don't, candidly, and some people do, and that's fine too, right? So, and we're not going to ask you generally, even if you're in a state where we can't, we're not going to ask you what you're making, right? We just don't. We're going to ask you your expectations, right? Casey, did I say that correctly?
No, that's right. My only advice is don't put us or yourself in a position where, you know, you're lying to us to try and gain leverage or anything like that. Right? It just makes you look bad, us look bad, and then, you know, just angers our client and the place you're trying to work, right? If you want to just be transparent as you'd like to be, but, you know, be straightforward with us around what you're looking for, right? If we give you a range and what you're looking for is 2x, tell us, right? Yeah. Don't try and push forward. Most of our clients aren't going to offer you 2x because they love you so much. Some might, but generally that's just not going to happen. So, you know, save your time, save our time. You know, if you ask us to keep things confidential, we will. Right? That's part of our job.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is lawyers love to use the term non-negotiable. Well, if you say something is non-negotiable, it really needs to be non-negotiable, because And reload is a perfect example. You know, your kid's a junior in high school and you cannot relocate. If that's non-negotiable, fine, but don't set up sort of false barriers, because I think that embarrasses everyone.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Another question from one of our audience members: is there a difference between the titles general counsel or chief legal officer? Is there one that's more prestigious than the other? Is that something to consider in your job search?
I'll take a crack at this. You know, it's really, again, goes back to the culture of the company, right? Some companies don't have CLOs, some companies do. Some companies have a CLO and a general counsel, and that usually means the CLO is higher and maybe has the CCO reporting to it. Titles are tough. You know, in financial services, some companies are doing away with legal titles altogether, right? It's just director, VP, head of legal. So titles, you know, I wouldn't read too much into the prestige of a title. I think the culture of the company, how they value the lawyer's opinion is what matters more. But, you know, that's just my take on my observations of our clients.
Great, thank you.
John has an opinion. I want to hear it.
I had this very question yesterday, and you know, look, listen, we all have egos, right? We all have egos, and you know, if you're sitting around the room and everybody's chief this, chief that, chief this, and you're not, then you're like, well, who am I? You know, I don't know. I mean, these guys are sort of day-to-day dealing with it. I do think, however, that having that CLO title kind of protects you from maybe someone coming in saying, you know what, maybe we need a little bit more gray hair. We'll put in a CLO above the general counsel. And I have seen that happen. So, you know, it's rare, it's remote, but it's something that is a potential exposure. So if someone were asking me if it was if it wouldn't upset the apple cart and they were asking me what title to take, yeah, I think I might opt for CLO.
Yeah, and John, my point actually, I think, agrees with you. If everybody's a chief and they want you to be at that table, you should be the chief legal officer, right? That's the culture of that company. So you want to be a part of it.
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to add, which I think it goes towards John's point, is a lot of times a company will have a chief legal officer and then a general counsel, and the chief legal officer, legal is one thing, but maybe their role is a little bit broader. Now, that doesn't mean people with the general counsel title don't have broader roles either, because they do. But, you know, sometimes in particularly large companies, there'll be a chief legal officer and then a general counsel who's managing the day-to-day operations of the legal department. And then the chief legal officer may have communications, government affairs, a bunch of other areas. So.
Related to that question is the EVP, SVP thing.
Yes.
How do you where does that fit in?
Yeah.
It really is company dependent, wholly company dependent, right? The titling between, you know, a grain company and a financial service company is totally different. But you can usually figure out, you know, the hierarchy pretty easily, especially when you're interviewing.
So John, can I ask you a question? So when does someone call you? Like they call you at the stage that Casey called you at, but talk a little bit more about how the interaction with you plays out and when you pick up the phone. Because we get asked that, right? And at what stage and all that good stuff, and for what reasons?
Well, I'm going to use a tortured metaphor, but it's, you know, it's once you hook the fish, then I help you reel it in and clean it and cook it. You've got to be the candidate. You've got to be the person who they've narrowed down and said, and you guys will usually signal that, you know, look, you know, maybe you can't say it directly, but you will usually signal that. And then that's the time to begin to sort of plot your strategy. But it's always the candidate's obligation to make them fall in love with you. But once you're the one, that's when you can reach out to me. Because if you reach out to me before and you don't get it, I mean, once I run conflicts and take you on as a client, the meter's on.
Yeah.
And, you know, you want to make certain that you're going to be the person who's going to secure this job. So that's usually it. When they get enough signals from you, from the CHRO, from the CEO, from the board chair, that they're the candidate.
Lauren, how are we doing on our
Great.
question?
I think we have time for one more. And I just want to touch on the idea that you kind of touch on the role play, whereas the idea that you've never sat in the seat a discount is deserved. Is that true, not true? Is that typically what you see as far as attitudes from the candidates you're working with or the firms you're working with?
To John's point, it's definitely a negotiation tactic. It is brought up at the negotiating table. It does happen. But again, if you're managing a function as a regional general counsel that's bigger than the company that you're heading to, is there a discount? Probably not. Maybe you have more responsibility. But at the end of the day, it's really about the role you're stepping into, right? If they think you're the right person, whether you were a DGC before or not, then you should be paid for the role. Right, you're stepping into that role whether you were a DGC before or not, or GC before or not.
I mean, again,
Yeah.
all of this is really more art than science. We're trying to come up with rationales for why we're entitled to more. They're trying to come up with rationales for why you're not entitled to it. And that is a very easy default explanation, which is you want your first GC opportunity, you haven't done this, you may not have the leverage, therefore, we're going to use that against you. You as a candidate have to decide whether or not you believe that argument, or whether you believe that argument justifies less than what a more experienced person would get. I don't think it does. I don't.
I agree. I think the other thing is I really do believe that we work with savvy CHROs at the GC level, and they understand that if they're going to bring in somebody at the deputy level, that person, and especially if there's someone, obviously, if they've gone through this whole process, there's someone they really want, right? That you're not going to try to get them at a discount because they haven't been a general counsel, right? So, and again, and especially in this compensation world we're in, right, where there's so much focus on the numbers and they become so high, I think companies begin to understand for these critical high-level GC roles, division GC roles, deputy GC roles, you got to pay people, not all the time, right? But, you've got to, meaning that they don't understand it all the time, but you've got to pay people what the position is worth. That's why it just doesn't matter what people make, right? It matters what you leave on the table. That's important to know, but what your base and bonus are, and again, unless they're very, very high and you want to share them because you want to make sure you're not going to get less, that's another issue. So.
Well, thank you all so much. We've had some glowing comments as well as questions. And from the attendees, and one said it was the single best role play that they've ever seen. I would have to agree. I think you did an excellent job. Again, really fun, really informative. And John, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with us. Casey and Heather, thank you as well. You can look for an email from us with a link to this recording. So if you find it especially helpful, share it with your colleagues, friends, family, and look for more webinars from MLA in the future. Thank you all, everyone. We hope you enjoyed and found it informative.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Lauren.
agency. Bye.